Hi there, and welcome to this module of Made Sense, in which I continue the conversation about the first episode. So the first 7 or 8 weeks that led to my first panic attack, and I'll show you, a way to kind of how I sort of map my experience to show you the other layers, that this weird phenomenon presented. So in the first video, I showed you that it was pretty logical that the only conclusion that I would reach about what this phenomenon was is that it was my neighbors. I didn't know what hearing voices was at all, so I wasn't going to sit there and think, gosh, this is just hearing voices. I didn't even know what that was. I heard people talking about what I was doing. So of course, the only people that could logically have been was the upstairs neighbors. And then I showed you how just when I could hear people talking about what I was doing and in which rooms, and in the apartment and then outside the apartment, how the when and where shifted the context every time, that then presented a whole new series of what the bleep questions. And at the end of that video, I highlighted that actually this phenomenon has more tricks up its sleeve that it can use to present new contexts. So that's what I want to show you in this video, is the other tricks up the sleeve that voices presented to me to keep changing the context with everything that they, not just what they said, but the other things that I'll talk about that prompted a whole new series of what the bleep questions. So I'll show you the kind of, if you like, I'm going to call it sort of layering, because there are these different layers, if you like, to the phenomenon, and of course they act together to change, to set the scene, to keep changing scenarios, which of course, as I spark this whole new kind of cycle. So I'll show you how, we've already spoken about how what voices said. I'll take you beyond the first two comments, when and where, which we've discussed, and then the style of the interaction with voices, and the mode. And by the mode, I mean sort of one-way communication, two-way communication. You'll see that more in the video. I'll show you, how when you've kind of mapped your experience, you'll have a hard time convincing me or anyone else, I believe, that this is a chemical imbalance that could produce this. And of course, mapping this is something, I think generally you will find that if you're someone who hears voices, you probably only need to do this once, just to kind of, help yourself see your experience in a completely different way. And then I'll show you the unseen impact. So, all of the stuff that's going on has an unseen impact in terms of how it's contaminating our frames of reference. So I'll show you that, and then I'll pick out one or two key points to take, as a takeaway from this particular video. So these other dimensions of what the phenomenology presents, are just more ways to add to the confusion. And add complications to the problems that you're trying to solve. So the confusion is, it gives you this sort of, deer caught in the headlights look, where you just really don't know what's happening, and of course that doesn't feel very good. And then of course voices are presenting much more information, as I say, in these sort of layers that just keep making it more and more complicated. So remember that actually all it took was two comments. Which I heard as people talking about what I was doing, that then led to the conclusion that actually the only reasonable answer, the only reasonable explanation, the only reasonable interpretation of what this thing was that it had to be the upstairs neighbors, who were the only other people who had access to the fire escape, which was the only place from which you would be able to see what I was doing. And then I showed you in the first episode video that we could map that as a process. And of course, that's what I'm going to do here. So as a reminder, these are the sort of 7 steps, if you like. There's the context, which sets our expectation. These comments were unexpected, so those are the stimuli that was actually presented. This is, what we're talking about here, and in this video in particular, is the other facets of this phenomenology. It produces a reaction as the new information mixes with our patterns and what we expect. And usually it's introducing conflict, so that gets our attention. And when what has our attention is the stuff that we're assessing and thinking about. And of course, in this case, we're assessing the implications of what this actually means And through that, we're reaching interpretations of this. So my interpretations were initially, it's the neighbors. When it persisted, the frame of reference that I was populating was the neighbors who went from curious to gossipy to intrusive to spying on me. Those are just different interpretations. And of course, the emotional experience of that was not very pleasant. And I showed you how that escalated, to the point where, because the problem became unsolvable, and I was unable to get away from voices, that's what led to the panic attack. And that our lived experience is, if you like, the experience in the mind is this series of episodes with new contexts all the time, and how some of those spilled over into behavior. And I'll show you here that one of our issues is that we are focusing down here at the expressed behavior. We're diagnosing on the basis of interpretations. We're calling them delusional. We're talking about people being having panic attacks, so these are the kind of episodes. And then, of course, the implications of all of this, the changes to our sort of frames of reference, leads to limiting beliefs and lack of confidence, and all of these kinds of things. So we're seeing these as symptoms. They're actually outcomes, derived from these unusual stimuli. And I'll show you how what we need to be doing is focusing up here and looking at the process, because this is the piece that's common to all of us. And of course, down here, our interpretations are very much individual. So of course, what we're doing when we're working down here is we're analyzing the person. So this experience then leads to psychoanalysis of the individual. Whereas what we're doing, if we can look at from this point of view, we can analyze the process and we can analyze the situation. So I have to show you that that's actually a more useful approach. So what I want to do here is actually map my first 7 or 8 weeks, in which I introduce the other layers that this strange phenomenon presented. So there's the when and the where, which I've already spoken about in the first video on the first episode. I'm going to add how the content progressed. So there were more things, obviously, that I heard my neighbors saying. And that sort of progressed over the 7 or 8 weeks. There was the style within which it was said. This is part of the body language that I talk about in the phenomenology slides. And then I'm going to talk about the mode. So this is a very specific change in the phenomenology, where the interaction between myself and this phenomenon was one way at first and then became two-way across these 7 or 8 weeks. And of course, that has significant implications as well. And then I'll show you that, as you've already seen, how the emotions escalate. And of course, it's this stuff that's prompting the behavior. So this is, the spillover is based on these unhappy emotions, leading me to actually do particular things, which I'll show you are actually very, very predictable. That was one of the other things I said at in the first video on the first episode. That actually some of our interpretations and behaviors are quite predictable. And I'll show you here that actually you'll see that they're quite reasonable given the context in which you find yourself when presented with this phenomenon. So first of all, I heard people talking about what I was doing in the living room in my apartment. It was this, he seems to be okay, he eats better than we do. Those two comments by this voice that I interpreted female, and then this male voice in the background, grunting sort of as if sort of less interested. And at first I interpreted that as okay. My emotion was quizzical, wondering why this is actually happening. Of course, I rationalized that by saying, they were checking up on me because I'd hurt myself that afternoon and made a lot of noise. So of course, it was just a few comments for over maybe 20 minutes on the first day. And of course, for me, the style, if I analyze it, after the fact, was that they were sort of curious. At least they were, as I say, I translated that as checking up on me. And then the mode is, and I'm using this language here particularly because this is the kind of language you see in the research on the phenomenology, is that actually voices were talking to each other about my activity at first. And then when they started to kind of talk about the fact that I wasn't working, for example, that shifted to then talking about me. And what this does is it shifts the context again. So it shifts what I focus on, it shifts my attention. And of course, I'm then looking for new inputs in that frame of reference. So initially it was what I was doing, say, and then just with these changes in language, what was happening was that it shifted my frame of reference from what I was doing then to me as a person. And this is the point, it became more personal, because this was information that I had not shared with them. It's not information they would have gained from peeking in at my window, checking up on me on day one. This was something that they knew some other way. So of course that those things seem subtle, but I'm hoping that you'll see here that what's happening in the mind, of course, is they're provoking new what the bleep questions in different frames of reference. Of course, here it was, how can they see me? Here it was, what the bleep are my neighbors up to? And how do they know all this stuff about me? Okay, so that's a very different set of questions that the mind actually asks. And I say, this was slightly uncomfortable for me, so I went and knocked on their door and got no reply and left it. So the next step for me, was this continued curiosity, this kind of thing. What's he doing? Sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Literally when someone's peeking on what someone's doing, there's a word for it anyway. And of course, it changed in nature for me when I could hear my neighbors speaking about what I was doing in the bedroom and in the bathroom. So, I found it was happening now in the beginning of the day and more times during the day. And it would start literally, his eyes are closed, but I think he's awake. Kind of sort of comment from one voice, and now actually a third voice, kind of saying, what is he doing? So these two voices to me both, sounded that they were likely to be women, and the male voice still occasionally grunted, but these two got sort of a bit more sort of chatty about what it is that I was doing, as I say, and because it was bedroom and bathroom, my emotion was more distressed, if you like, not hugely distressed, but certainly uncomfortable. And that led me to call friends, because I've now decided confronting the neighbors isn't going to produce any results, because if I'm hearing them in the bedroom and the bathroom and there's this kind of conversation going, it's unlikely that they would acknowledge it. And of course, I've told them, then they know I know, well, kind of, so what? So my approach was actually to call friends. I mean, really, those are the only two options. So I say this is predictable. I'm either going to, well, three, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to, go and confront the neighbors, or I'm going to ask somebody else for their advice, or see if they can actually, offer some sensible ideas. Pretty straightforward stuff, really, when you analyze it this way. So of course now what happened is, I'm now after this, because I'm unhappy with that, besides calling my friends, I also started looking at my technology, because I was convinced, okay, this was the only way that I could see this kind of happening. It had to be cameras, because obviously the people weren't in my room, in the bathroom or the bedroom, and so you certainly couldn't see them from the fire escape. So of course there had to be some other means, and the most logical thing was a camera. And of course I started investigating my PC and then later on my phone. And of course looking for cameras in the apartment. And of course that was supported by the sort of language that voices we were using. It was this kind of gossipy stuff about what he's doing. Oh, he cleans so beautifully, and he's doing this and he's doing that. And of course, so that's this sort of gossipy kind of style, and it's growing to sort of more times during the day. So it was almost this, oh, he seems to be awake, what's he doing, is it going to be an interesting day kind of flavor to it. Gossip, gee, he cleans so well, I don't know why that fascinated them, but it did. Anyway, a couple of other comments about what I was doing. As I said, it has this gossipy characteristic. And then at some point, I heard them talking about what I was doing on my PC and literally commenting on, when I was going onto my PC and doing some internet banking. So of course, my internet banking information being shared with my neighbors is not something that I'm going to enjoy. So of course now this, the content has become intrusive. And of course, even though, they're kind of saying it matter-of-factly, I'm now interpreting that the neighbors are downright intrusive. And of course, this is just not acceptable for me. And what I started to do was I moved my desk this way and that way and this way and that way to make sure that actually it couldn't be seen from the fire escape. And of course, I still got these comments, of course, which made me even more. Sorry, this was now starting to make me angry. And by this stage, I started working outside the apartment, and of course, that's not acceptable as a routine for me. And I gave notice of the apartment because I couldn't see a way to solve the problem. So whilst this seems like irrational stuff to somebody observing this, because they don't have all this information and they can't understand why the neighbors would be spying on me. This is the point. I can't understand why the neighbors would be spying on me either. Then it's the implications of that are leading to all this behavior. And it's not irrational at all. It's entirely rational. Anybody else would do the same thing, okay? Any other option I had was to confront the neighbors. And of course, I didn't see that as producing a reasonable result. It was a furnished apartment. I was able to find another one that was actually cheaper, and of course, it just meant giving notice and moving was an easy thing to do. And of course, meantime, as this is continuing, because I now have another, I don't know, 4 weeks left in this apartment. I'm still kind of hearing voices, and I'm investigating my own sort of technology and looking for cameras in the apartment. And at some point, I had this comment again that he's on his banking site, and I realized that actually, if my neighbors could see my PC screen, I could write them a note. So it was almost like sort of catching them in the act, if you like. So all I did was I opened Word or Notepad, whatever, and I typed them a note kind of saying, look, this is not cool. I'm aware of it. I suggest you stop. I probably had an or else in there, although I have no idea what that or else would have been because I don't know what I could have done about it. But I was firm. I'm not sure how polite I was. I was basically saying, get lost. This is not acceptable. Of course, the response that then produced from voices was that the voices got quiet that night. When I typed the note, I went to sleep. I woke the next morning to, I don't know, 7, 8, 10 voices yelling at me. And just this constant barrage of comments. And of course, this is something that is just unreal. I have absolutely no idea what this is. I'm completely gobsmacked. I have no idea, what to think of this. And of course, the style now is very much bullying. It's do this, put that there, take this away. You're commenting on, again, actually on my activity, but literally everything I'm doing now, not just, these occasional sort of comments. They're now commenting on everything I do, and they're now here all day. Okay, so it's become an all-day thing of voices now talking to me, as opposed to each other about what I'm doing, and then me. It's now shifted to voices talking to me. So this has now become very, very personal. This bullying is a consequence of the fact that I typed them a note saying this was unacceptable. And what's happened here is voices have now imposed consequences on me for me simply taking an action aimed at stopping them. I say voices, my neighbors, okay? Because that's still who I think this is at this point. So of course, what's happened here now, of course, is to say it's this all day. And of course, the next shift comes when I start to hear the voices outside of the apartment. As I mentioned in the first video, it was a slightly gradual thing over 3 days or so that they moved from in the apartment to the landing, to down the staircase to the street, to up the road a block or more. But I was pretty much, hearing voices all day at home. And some of the time when I was, walking around outside, I don't really know how to represent that as a visual, but I've got a solid arrow here. Of course, what that led me to do was I was still feeling completely gobsmacked. I had no idea what this meant. I was convinced that it had to be something to do with technology. I'd done lots of work at the cafe, looking at my PC. I got a PC technician in, and I started using an internet cafe. And of course, that didn't help either, because every time I actually went to a PC in the internet cafe, my voices got very, very busy, and they kind of said, "What do you think you're doing? We can, we can track you from your login details. We know your name. We know that you're using your email address to log into this site, and we know your, what you're logging, how you're logging into that site. We can see what you're doing." So even going to an internet cafe, wasn't any good either. So now I've got this very I don't know, unkind view of technology, as one way to put it. I've developed very much a sensitivity to technology and how it's not working for me in my life at this point. And this is something that has persisted for 10 years of this experience with voices, because they became very, very busy whenever I used PCs and even my phone. They sort of just contaminated all the information related to them. But of course, what this is about now is that the voices have become very, very threatening because they're outside. My explanation that it's the neighbors is now doubtful. I mean, it seems unlikely that my neighbors would have the technology to follow me around wherever I'm going. And actually, one thing might be my PC and my phone, which they could have accessed by climbing in the window through my apartment. But actually, something in an internet cafe is a completely different story altogether. So of course, what I did at this stage was, having just formatted my PC and having only one weekend left in this apartment, I didn't want to take the PC back to the apartment, so I checked into a hotel for my last 2 days of having this apartment before the next one was available. I checked into this hotel, and of course, I barely stepped into the room, as I mentioned in the previous video on first episode. And of course, I started to hear voices there as well. And of course, I was now still convinced this had to be a technology thing, and I started picking my PC apart. And I went up to a friend, as I say, who managed to calm me down. And I actually went to a second hotel, because I didn't want to go back to the first one, but I was calmed down. And actually, oddly enough, I didn't hear the voices in the second hotel. But a day or two later, I went to the doctor, who described it as auditory hallucinations. But of course, I walked out of the doctor's office with a prescription for an antipsychotic for a week. But of course, what's happening is I'm still hearing all of this. I've still got 6, 7, 8, 10 voices yelling at me all day, throwing new stuff at me and confusing me completely. I, of course, now have absolutely no idea what this is about. And somewhere in all this confusion, the sort of mode of interaction between voices and I had moved to a two-way communication. So I describe this a bit more in the videos on the phenomenology, but this is really a pretty common, in fact, probably the most common experience of what we call hearing voices, is that it's actually a two-way conversation where my thoughts are expressed as half of the conversation with voices. So it becomes an interaction at the level of thought. I hear my own thoughts as in what's called a thought echo. So my thought and what voices are saying are transmitted and received in the same bandwidth, if you like. It's a way to kind of think about it. So it's almost this telepathic-like kind of experience. At least, some of us interpret it as a form of telepathy. I'm not saying it is telepathy. I'm saying that it's a word that we have that sort of more or less describes it. But I say it's this common one bandwidth in which there's this transmit and receive, where my thoughts are transmitted to voices, to this entity called auditory hallucinations by this stage. And of course, what voices are saying is directed, at me, in this kind of same bandwidth. So, of course, what you see from this, this whole thing is that actually when you map the experience like that, when you're able to actually step back and separate those layers, and I must say I didn't get there quickly. It took me years actually, and in fact every time I do one of these slides, in fact every time I talk to that slide, this is probably the 5th time that I've done this video talking to that slide. Every time I do it, I see another little slant, another little nuance. And of course, it's just that, voices, this phenomenon is presenting, all these weird stimuli, information, so what they say, the content, the body language, the location, the style, the mode, all of those things are coming together in a very strategic and tactical way that led me to a belief that it was the neighbors, that voices could impose consequences, that I couldn't escape them. And of course, that's what led to the panic. And then even after I'd been to the doctor and had a new description for it, I was still left with this sort of horrible piece. Now, you'd have a very difficult time convincing me that actually a chemical imbalance could produce that. And certainly, my experience of taking meds, I went to my GP, who gave me antipsychotics for a week. Actually, much later on, about probably a year later, I went to a psychiatrist and was given one antipsychotic, which was absolutely awful. I put on 25 kilograms, that's over 50 pounds in 8 or 9 weeks. I felt absolutely awful. I felt my emotions were dulled. I became depressed, and in fact, and I put that actually down to the antipsychotic. Certainly, the side effects were awful. As I say, for me, it actually didn't make any difference to my voices anyway. All it did was dull my emotions. And of course, if your emotions are dulled, your experience of life is dulled. So I didn't actually sit on the couch and have any kind of psychoanalysis. Some psychiatrists do get involved in this and have some interesting, well, to me, uninteresting ideas about the kind of logic of how this works. And I'm hoping that you'll see from the previous slide that actually this thing is so confusing and so complicated that it's not easy to see what is going on there. And of course, when somebody who hears voices is presenting at the mental health professionals, we're not in a good state of mind. It's usually after a panic attack, and actually we can't see the wood for the trees at the time. As I said, it took me years to kind of sift through those layers of the phenomenology. And of course, I was diagnosed as schizophrenia, and as I kept saying, actually, whether I was diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar or schizoaffective disorder, or some other thing, or some other non-specific version of, which is another variation on a theme when there isn't a neat box to put you into, it would have changed depending on the day I went to go and talk to the psychiatrist. Literally, I would have had one diagnosis this week and another diagnosis the next week, because voices presented differently, every day, really. So for me, I think key message from here is actually that this is not going to solve the problem we've seen on the previous page. Worse than that, there's a lot of harm that is happening that we're actually not seeing. And when I say it's neuroplastic harm, so what I mean by neuroplastic harm is that actually the relationship between information and emotion is being contaminated by this exposure to this unusual phenomenon. It's certainly very obviously contaminating my information. It was not my neighbors, clearly. And I wasted a whole lot of effort on solving a fake problem. And of course, those 7 or 8 weeks led to a panic attack, and all of those emotions were, if I evaluate them in the context of the real world, were entirely unnecessary and irrelevant. They were very real and they were awful, but it was all as a result of this interaction with this strange phenomenon. So let me give you just an idea of some of the unseen harm that we're kind of seeing, in our sort of frames of reference. And I'm using the same chart. I'm just going to pick out a few things, and I'll skip through this very quickly because you'll get the idea. Pretty straightforward. We've got to think about what the implications of this experience for how I view the world. Really, that's really what's happening here. So the whole idea, when voices are sort of talking about what I'm doing, at home and all day, is it means that I suddenly have no privacy. Not only no privacy at home, I have no privacy in the mind. Okay. And that's actually a pretty awful thing to consider when you realize that this thing is going to stick with you for probably the rest of your life. Only about 15% of people, voices stop for about 15% of people. For the other 85% of people still hear them in one way or another. And when you realize that, it's not a good moment in this journey. Of course, this is the point. You can hear them anytime, any place. And of course, voices make time an issue. That your mind kind of say, "We're here, Greggy boy. We're not going anywhere. We're here to stay." That's not a very pleasant thing to consider, because the experience of it is not pleasant at all. And of course, voices are now throwing all these assertions and opinions into your thought processes, literally into your processor, into the mind. So this information is arriving. A lot, they're connecting it to your activity. So they're commenting whilst you're doing something else. And of course, this is the problem. This is how they're polluting the real world, if you like. So this is the stuff that's producing the problem that I'm trying to solve. Because voices are now talking about the fact that I'm on my banking site and they're saying, and your password is blah, 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 and they repeat it, implying that they can share it in some way or another. So of course, if you think it's your neighbors that are spying on you, then the possibility that it will be shared is a very real one. And suddenly, this idea of no privacy, you can see, what it means. It's not just at home. It's literally every single thing, that you do. I mean, these silly voices even commented on how I peed, for example. I had a bladder infection at the time. And peeing was slow. So of course, I sat down instead of standing up. And of course, voices made an issue of that. The whole drama for, I don't know, the 2 or 3 weeks, whatever, that before the problem actually went away. Was something that they commented on every time. So, a few times a day, because at that point I was going more often. But anyway, so I mean, some of this really silly stuff. I mean, it's actually meaningless. Obviously, some of it. So that bit of me, in the bathroom, completely meaningless stuff, but annoying and very, very irritating. And of course, is offending my sense of privacy, significantly. Of course, voices are bullying, so they're making all these threats and sort of promises, and the promises are actually in the form of a threat. They're imposing very real consequences. I typed a note. They came back in force as being bullies. It has consequences in life. I wasted a lot of effort, time, money on moving, on having my PC fixed, on 2 hotels, all resources thrown at a completely fake problem. I mean, this stuff really is enough to make you angry, as you can hear. I'm starting to get angry. Of course, it introduces complications in your life. The moment I started talking to my friends and the landlady, of course, it introduces this kernel of something peculiar into those relationships. And we see this with a lot of people, a lot of relationships go downhill. So asking for help is actually very, very difficult, because actually you can see the complication in this, and you've seen the process in the other one, how your emotions are escalated. So when we're emotional, we're not telling a rational story. And of course, this is making us very, very emotional. So of course, we're struggling to tell you what's going on, and you're seeing us as confused. Okay. Well, we are confused. I'm just showing you, how complicated it is, and it's no surprise, that we're confused when we're trying to tell you this, because not only is this experience absolutely horrendous, we can't even find the words, to describe it to you. And of course, there's this prospect all the time, new themes that you've seen me talk about in the other videos. So I'm going to have more episodes. That's kind of quite likely. So I need to do. So I'm anticipating these problems as well. So this is what I mean when I say it's actually contaminating our information and our emotion. And of course, what's happening is we're asking what next. And I'm simply saying what we need to do is we can to simplify it. You might map this experience once and then kind of say, okay, let's put the focus on the phenomenology. So one is actually the content is to me irrelevant in and of itself. What we need to recognize about it is that it's designed to confuse and to complicate and to change the context so that it sparks another cycle of what the bleep questions. The style will change how we're interpreting it. So for me, my voices are very, very threatening. So I look at them as downright malign, freaking evil things, because that's the experience of it. So this is the body language piece of it. Duration is an issue. So if voices are coming along and saying, "Here, Greggy boy, and I'm here to stay," of course, and you don't see a way to make the problem less distressing, that in itself is an awful thing. So this is this anticipation and expectation of it. As I'll show you in the phenomenology videos, whether you're experiencing voices talking to each other about you, or a thought echo, or a thought intrusion, or hearing voices actually changes how we react and respond to it, and changes the what the bleep questions that we're prompted to ask. I've shown you how the where voices present is important to say. For me, this kind of checking into the hotel meant I couldn't get away from them, and of course, no surprise. If we think about, I would say that these 5 themes would probably suffice for anybody to map their whole experience. There are other characteristics, that I say if people sort of map using these 5, it should be enough to radically change how you see the experience of voices and an episode. And so for me, it was much easier to do this when I focused on my first 7 or 8 weeks, because 20 weeks in, I had many, many more interpretations, and of course that's what my focus was on. It became much clearer when I went back to the early part of the experience, and of course I'm hoping that some people will get that benefit simply from seeing me do it, because they'll just recognize enough similarities in their own experience to be convinced actually that they're not the problem. It's the phenomenon. It's the phenomenon that's the problem. Of course, this spills over into emotions. This is causing the extreme states of hearing voices do all these things. And of course, some of this spills over into behavior. And of course, what I want to do is show you that these extreme states are an entirely reasonable response or reaction to this bullying. And that actually, when this stuff spills over into crazy stuff that we do, like checking on cameras in my apartment, moving out, taking my PC apart, wasting all that money on this fake problem, is also an entirely reasonable thing to do. And it's not something you should be beating yourself over the head about and kind of saying, I've ruined my life because I've done these stupid things. That's not the case at all. These powerful emotions, particularly if it is a threatening experience, requires action. We dissipate the chemicals that our threat system produces by taking action. We either run or we fight, okay? And in this case, those opportunities were not available, and of course it spills over into these other behaviors in terms of trying to solve the problem. So I hope you've figured out from that actually that this phenomenon is a miserable, vile thing, that actually it's enough to drive you crazy and to drive you mad. It doesn't to me appear that there's anything wrong with our minds. I'm pretty sure my mind is fine. It's that this other thing is happening in parallel, and that's what's causing all the drama. And of course, asking the what to believe questions is producing the experience of it, because it's as that processor literally processes the information, it's resulting in emotions, which is the stuff that we actually feel. So regardless of what I believe about voices, because the problem seems insolvable, it's going to keep producing this these episodes of thinking and emotions along the way, and sometimes they will spill over into behavior. So the keep it simple idea to take away from this thing is that this jack in the box is downright deceitful. It adds confusion and complication deliberately. This is why we've been struggling so to understand it. Number 2, we need to recognize that actually everything flows from the phenomenology. we must, analyzing, psychoanalyzing the person is actually not going to produce any results. At the very best, what it will do, we may have, problems, emotional issues from our past, which will make us sensitive to particular themes. I was lucky in that I didn't. Having said that, voices created themes for me to become sensitive to. I've mentioned technology, for example. There were a few other things, themes to which I developed sensitivities as a result of voices picking on those themes to badger me. So, if anybody has had problems in their past, so being abused as a child, for example, I'm simply saying voices will actually complicate that rather than make it simpler, and that actually, the kind of methodologies for, treating those emotional issues already exist. That what you want to do if we're hearing voices is we need to put the focus on the phenomenology. And what we need to do is recognize that actually it's our beliefs that shape the experience, and not just our beliefs, our questions about what this thing might be. So the process of reaching an interpretation, as we're assessing the implications, is also the experience of it. And what's characteristic here is that the belief is something we hold very strongly. So I was absolutely convinced it was my neighbors. Until I started to hear voices, outside of the apartment, and that actually all of the distress came from the doubts of, that arose from the implications of it being my neighbor. So it's this belief and doubt working together, and of course that's aided and abetted, by the style of voices. They were very aggressive, very deceitful. I had no idea what they were capable of, so I didn't know what to expect. Became hyper vigilant, and of course, this not knowing what they're capable of or what to expect is what's producing the fear. And then, of course, then when you go and get help, it causes problems because I'm experiencing it and you don't. You're inclined to analyze me and say, oh, it's because this happened and this happened. And actually, what happens is other people start to impose their beliefs on you because you're not in the best state of mind at the stage. And of course, we struggle to describe all of this level of complexity and confusion. So getting help is difficult, and relationships head downhill, all because of this strange phenomenon introducing this nonsense that it's throwing at us. So this is what we have to focus on, and this is what we have to fix. So thanks for listening to this video. Please help me keep some of this free for people who hear voices if you can. I have a fundraiser called Someone You Know Hears Voices on crowdrise.com. Please use this hashtag if you're commenting on social media. If you'd like to work together, you can reach me on greg@mad-sense.com. Sign up on my website, subscribe to this channel. And as I mentioned before, there are other players in the field that also work off donations. So if you can offer any help, we would all appreciate that. So thanks for listening.